The federal government believed it had secured a 30-day pause on any Canadian exports to the U.S., that is, on tariffs on any Canadian exports to the U.S. Canada sends about $11 billion worth of steel south of the border each year, or about 90% of total production. It also exports an equivalent dollar figure in aluminum, which accounts for more than half of American consumption. Here's Donald Trump speaking to reporters on Air Force One about tomorrow's planned tariff announcement.
What countries will those go on?
Everybody. Steel.
Including Canada and Mexico?
Yeah. Any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum too.
10%?
No, 25%.
25 for aluminum?
25 for both.
Are you going to retaliate? Is Canada a viable country?
No comment from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Trump's latest announcement. Trudeau is in Paris tonight as he prepares to attend a conference while meeting with EU leaders in hopes to strengthen trade alliances there. Ottawa has previously vowed to retaliate if the U.S. imposes tariffs on Canada. Now let's get more now on this breaking news story from Tricia Kindleman. Tricia, these remarks about tariffs on steel and aluminum literally came out of the blue. What more can you tell us? He just made these announcements on his flight on Air Force One when we thought he would be, frankly, chilling and preparing for the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I think on Super Bowl Sunday, everyone thought that the talk of tariffs and that sort of thing was going to be sort of shelved while we would focus on a football game. But that's not how things go under a Trump administration. So here we are examining what these comments could mean for Canada, and not just Canada. You know, for Mexico, of course, we know that they are another major trading partner with the U.S. But as Donald Trump said this evening, that these tariffs, this 25% on aluminum and steel, would be applied to all aluminum and steel coming into the United States. So that will be when it comes from any country that it does business with. There was a lot of discussion towards the latter part of last week about allowing some Chinese investment into their steel company. Now, Trump did say that they weren't going to go that far and let them invest in U.S. steel. But again, just throwing all of these sort of trade deals and things for a loop, to say the least. Now, I wanted to touch on, Deanna, we heard at the end of that clip there where we showed our Prime Minister walking in Paris there. One of the reporters yelling, "Is Canada a viable country?"
Yeah, so, I believe it was the voice of our colleague Ashley Burke.
Yes,
I'm not sure, but it sounds like Ashley.
It did. I do believe that you may be right on that it might have been Ashley Burke. But regardless, someone did yell, "Is Canada a viable country?" Now, of course, as Canadians, we're standing here saying, yes, of course it is. Now, I want to show you this part of the Air Force One press conference that we had earlier, where Trump seems to question whether Canada is a viable country or not.
And in the case of Canada, if this should happen, I don't know how they can do it without us, because without the U.S., Canada really doesn't have a country. They do almost all of their business with us. And if we say we want our cars to be made in Detroit, with a stroke of a pen, I can do that. And other things in addition to that would not allow Canada to be a viable country.
Now, given the threats of these tariffs that we've been under for a matter of weeks now, Deanna, that has definitely sparked the conversation amongst provincial leaders, amongst federal leaders about, this trade arrangement and this relationship that we do have with the country of the United States. Now, there has definitely been a lot of questions that have been brought up about the figures that Donald Trump is saying, hundreds of billions of dollars in deficit to America when it comes to our trade figures. Now, that doesn't necessarily seem to add up. One of the people who has been really out on the forefront, though, asking the questions about these figures that Donald Trump is bringing to the table has been Doug Ford. Of course, now you heard him say if we wanted cars produced in Detroit, a stroke of the pen, I could do that. Doug Ford was one of the first to respond this evening. Here's what he had to say in a post on social media. He said, "Now this is the next 4 years, shifting goalposts and constant chaos, putting our economy at risk." He went on to say, of course, now he is in the middle of his own election campaign, we have to bear in mind. mind. That's why he notes here, I'm asking for the people for a strong, stable four-year mandate that outlasts the Trump administration to do whatever it takes to always be ready to protect Ontario. We also have seen a number of these meetings of the provincial leaders, the premiers, and we are expecting for those gatherings to continue. But at this point, there are a lot of questions. And of course, now we have to also address, Deanna, a lot of those questions around the 51st state comments. Those were also something that have been heavily focused on while this tariff talk was happening. Now, we were once again told today from the Secretary of Defense, they're not going to invade Canada, but this doesn't stop them from this sort of economic steps that they could be taking. Here's what he had to say.
But just yes or no, is he planning to annex
part
Canada?
Of his policy. Well, I don't think there's any plans to invade Canada, if that's what you're talking about. But there is a lot of people that like what we have in the United States and do not like the last 10 years of liberal progressive governance in Trudeau. But really what you're seeing is a reassertion of American leadership in the Western Hemisphere from the Arctic all the way down to the Panama Canal. And that's what we're talking about, from Greenland to Arctic security, to the Panama Canal coming back under the United States. America has avoided our own hemisphere where we have the energy, the food, and the critical minerals for way too long, and you're seeing a reassertion of President Trump's leadership.
So, of course, that was a National Defense Secretary there who was, again, talking about these, National Defense Administrator, rather, talking about these steps that, we're seeing but not seeing as it continues to, again, as Ford kind of said, these moving goalposts seem to continually come into play here, Deanna.
Right, and he's alluding to many Canadians being supportive of the annexation idea, which polls in this country absolutely do not support that theory. Now, this news on tariffs on steel and aluminum comes tonight, Tricia, just days after the country breathed a collective sigh of relief that the crisis had been, if not entirely averted, then postponed, that there was this 30-day reprieve that Canada and Mexico had successfully negotiated. Does this negate that reprieve entirely? So many questions right now. What can you tell us?
I think that's where we're at, Deanna, is in a spot where there really is more questions and answers at this point. But what we do know is that Trump is expected to make these steel-related announcements, steel and aluminum announcements tomorrow. And then he said the reciprocal announcements would be coming on Tuesday or Wednesday. Now, our PM is in Paris for at least the next couple of days. We don't exactly know his schedule at this point. So I can imagine that there's going to be another flurry of high-level meetings, another flurry of activity, especially with those premier and that leader group as well. So I think we're going to continue to see the fallout as we go into a new week here, Deanna. I think this is going to be at the top of everyone's lists going into this week.
Tricia, thank you so much for that. CBC's Tricia Kindleman. Catherine Cobden is the president and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, and she joins us tonight from Ottawa. Catherine, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Deanna, for having me. Pardon me.
Catherine, I can tell you our jaws dropped here in the newsroom when we found out about the news and got that video from Air Force One. What was your reaction?
Well, certainly we're very concerned, but I'm trying to remain focused on a couple of facts. One is we do not yet know the details. We do not, for example, know whether for sure Canada would be included. I would hope that our primary objective as a country is to get us excluded from these tariffs. And I think that we have a very compelling story to tell as Canada. We've done some incredible things to seek that. But if these tariffs proceed, it's like they will be devastating, but challenging on both sides of the border, in fact, not just on Canada. So as the United States' largest trading partner on steel, we represent about 20% of all of their steel imports, and they represent about 40% of ours. So we are very highly integrated, very dependent on each other economically, and tariffs will have devastating effects on both sides of the border. So job one needs to be to get Canada excluded from what looks to be, at least if we take President Trump at his word during the press conference, something quite broadly based on many countries.
Just wanted to clarify, just because we got a chance to watch the entire tape, there were some follow-up questions. People did ask him, are Canada and Mexico exempt from that, given the 30-day reprieve that the two countries had negotiated? He said they're not exempt. So that, at least from what we know for now, it seems like the exemption does not hold. But as you said, so much is still unclear in how this will fold out.
Well, this is what I'm hoping is happening as we speak. I'm hoping the Canadian government is connecting with the Trump administration to once again remind them of the work we have done to align our trade policy, of the economic harm we'll have on both sides of the border, of the highly integrated nature of our business, and the $20 billion of steel trade that's basically exposed to this idea. So, again, as their largest trading partner in steel, I think and as one that has worked extremely hard to align with U.S. trade policy, taken direct measures against China, for example, I think we have a better and supply chain transparency. No one else in any other trading relationship on steel has done this but Canada and the United States. So I think we have a very strong narrative to advance tonight. If that doesn't happen, then we have a very strong necessity to respond hard and fast with retaliatory tariffs of our own.
What I wanted to ask you is, when you mentioned that figure, $20 billion, we know that 90% of Canada's steel exports do go to the U.S. These are huge figures, almost too big to wrap your head around. Tell us, what could this possibly do to the Canadian economy? And I want to ask you about the U.S. economy as well, but primarily to Canadian steel producers, to all the people who are employed in these industries. What would the impact be?
It will be devastating. Now, I will say that we do ship it's not quite 90% of our production. It's a little over 50%. But the other thing we need to pivot to, and you're alluding to this, is we need to find mechanisms immediately to use more domestically produced steel in Canadian projects. Like, there's no reason why some of the largest infrastructure projects that have gone on in this country in the last decade did not use Canadian steel. That needs to change tomorrow.
Tell me, is there, a question everyone has to ask themselves when it does come to Donald Trump and this news cycle of his edicts and executive orders of the last 2-3 weeks, could this be another negotiating tactic? What's your feeling on that?
Well, that's what I'm hoping is taking place, and that the Canadian government is having these discussions to see what this is all about, to reinforce what we've done. As I've mentioned, many other nations have not done a direct action on overcapacity of steel like Canada and the United States. They have not done supply chain transparency like Canada and the United States. So, frankly, perhaps he's negotiating with other parts of the world. That's what I hope. Again, who knows? And I'm just trying to advise that we don't actually know the details today.
What can Canada and other countries, steel industry in other countries, do about this? We do know that the EU is very much in Donald Trump's crosshairs when it comes to tariffs and other economic sanctions. We do know that this is very much something that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is talking about to Emmanuel Macron and other European leaders. What do you think Canada can do and its allies to prepare themselves for the possible impact of this?
Again, I think for us, we believe that the best thing we can do is to strengthen the Canadian domestic market for steel. And there's two ways to do that. I mentioned one, but the other one is even more important, which is to keep unfairly traded dumped steel out of our country. So we need to keep that from entering into our country so that we can supply more Canadian steel in Canada, so that we're not being undercut and undermined by unfairly traded offshore imports.
Catherine, thank you so much for that. I know more details will become known in the days to come, but I really appreciate you responding this early in the game. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Catherine Cobden is the president and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. When U.S. President Donald Trump started threatening to impose tariffs, a lot of Canadians thought it was all part of his art of the deal negotiating tactics. But as those threats become more real, many of us want Canada to punch back hard and go beyond counter tariffs. And one of those people is Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He recently co-authored an article called "A Dozen Radical Responses to Trump's Economic Warfare That Go Beyond Canadian Counter Tariffs." Among his suggestions are imposing an energy export tax of 15%, repatriating U.S.-owned assets, especially in the resource sector, and targeting so-called oligarchs and Trump enablers, and strengthening domestic media and cultural industries. And joining me now, Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood is joining us from Ottawa. Hadrian, thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thanks for having me.
Look, some of these suggestions might have sounded more radical 6 months ago than they do now. I can tell you that we are hearing from our viewers, from our audience members all the time. And some of them have come up with exact same things that you have come up with based on your research. Let's start with suggestions of imposing an export tax on energy products of at least 15%. That's one of the ideas that have been discussed. But then you go on to suggest repatriating U.S. assets, kind of like Cuba did after its revolution. That's pretty strong stuff. Do you think that we've come to a point where we need these kinds of responses?
Yeah, it's hard to know, and you're right. It does sound extreme, and I think a year ago this wouldn't be on the table. And the circumstances now mean that we need to have these options on the table. It doesn't mean we do it tomorrow, but we need the U.S. to know that we're not joking around, and these threats of annexation need to be taken seriously. So, it's hard to know, as you say, whether this threat of tariffs, is that just a negotiating tactic, or is this kind of step one towards annexation? If it's the latter, we need to be ready with everything possible. And one of those options would be taking over control of U.S. companies and assets in Canada. It is extreme, but it may be necessary. You can't really allow U.S. businesses to operate here like everything is normal when these are clearly not normal times.
It's so interesting. I mean, you mentioned, of course, the threat of annexation, something that Donald Trump had repeated again in a Fox interview that just aired in the last 24 hours. So certainly this is something that he is doubling down on, and not just something that he mentioned once. Let's talk about the tariffs. I mean, Mexico and Canada have this 30-day reprieve from the proposed tariffs. Does that reprieve make you want to reconsider some of your suggestions? Or do you buy the argument that Trump is just using his out-of-the-deal business negotiating skills here?
It's really hard to try and get into Trump's head. I think all of us have tried and failed at some point. I mean, a 30-day delay, I don't think it really changes the equation much. I mean, he might delay it another 30 days. He might delay it 6 months. But the fact is, these tariffs are hanging over our heads, and they will as long as Trump's in power, maybe beyond. And maybe that's just part of the U.S. political, geopolitical toolbox now, is just threatening tariffs at any turn. So we need to take this seriously, whether or not these tariffs are imposed in a month or not. This is just the new reality that we can't really count on the U.S. as a trading partner in the way that we did, or we have for nearly a century.
You mentioned one of the other proposals are price controls on certain essentials. What would that accomplish? And is there a fear here that it would sound a little bit like rationing after the Second World War, where a family is entitled to an X number of eggs and a small chunk of butter every 2 weeks or so? Why do you think that this would be a good idea?
Yeah, so this would be one of a number of measures, and this one is less about hurting the U.S. and more just protecting Canadian households. So the thing about a trade war, which no one wins a trade war, and if we're in a situation where Canada is putting tariffs on U.S. goods to fight back against U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods, that could drive up the cost of living for Canadian families. It would be inflationary. And so there's a risk that in this trade war, all of a sudden, all kinds of essentials, including food, would get a lot more expensive. So we propose, it may be necessary. Again, none of this is set in stone, but it may be necessary to put in place price controls on some essential foods to make sure that they don't get really expensive all of a sudden. It's not necessarily a long-term solution, but it's just we need to be prepared because we don't really know how things are going to shake out. So that's one of the options on the table to make sure that Canadian households, aren't facing the brunt of the costs of this kind of trade war.
Another suggestion that you put forward is to target the people that you call the oligarchs and enablers that are cheering Trump on and enabling him to do all this stuff. I mean, people who have seen the inauguration, it was very easy to see, obviously, Elon Musk, a huge presence in the Trump administration, but also Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, people who control huge parts of media, social media. Do you think it would work, or would it just be symbolic? And first of all, would you get buy-in from Canadian people?
I think actually you'd get a lot more buy-in from Canadians for targeting oligarchs than you would for counter tariffs. As we were just discussing, you put counter tariffs on U.S. goods, and that just makes things more expensive. When we buy American goods, they get more expensive if there are tariffs. If, on the other hand, you say we're just going to directly target and sanction people close to Trump, you could freeze the assets or prevent them doing business in Canada. That would include things like, Musk owns X, the social media company, Starlink, the satellite company, Tesla, the electric vehicle company. You could put sanctions or controls or any. There's all kinds of different measures on the table that would target Musk directly, target these other billionaires directly, hit them personally, their wealth, their assets, and make them rethink it in a way that, if American consumers in the Midwest have to pay more for gas, I don't know that Trump and his billionaire friends care about that in the same way that they would care about their own assets. And to be clear, there's a lot of precedence for this. As soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, Canada and many other countries put sanctions on Russian oligarchs, saying, your wealth is frozen here. So this is an option for Canada.
I mean, just to push back a bit, of course, most Canadians would be hard-pressed to identify who the Russian oligarchs are in this country or what their product is, whereas so many Canadians love being on Meta, ordering products from Amazon. We also do know that the federal government has actually tried to limit, for example, the access that Meta has to Canadian news. This conversation you and I are going to have, you won't be able to share it on Facebook or Instagram. And I think that there is a sense of how successful this has been, not necessarily the most successful move. I mean, do you think this could work? I mean, certainly we're seeing this upsurgence of patriotism. People want to buy Canadian. People are canceling their vacations to the U.S. It does look like the atmosphere is ripe for some of these kinds of moves. Do you think that it's possible to limit or downright block the inroads of people who are so embedded in everyday lives of Canadians, like Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg?
I think that's a great point. Absolutely, there would be costs to Canadians, and we shouldn't, take it lightly. I think what's important to keep in mind here is that, all the things we're talking about right now, these are reactions to the U.S., basically to tell the U.S. administration that we are, we're not going to roll over in the face of these threats. And these kinds of reactions, for the most part, would only be necessary as long as the U.S. threat was there. If the U.S. does not follow through on its tariff threats, we wouldn't necessarily have to follow through on these kinds of sanctions. So it's not that this would necessarily be forever. And I think a lot of Canadians would be on board with, making some sacrifices in the short term to show the U.S. that we're serious about this trade war.
As they like to say, desperate times, desperate measures, right? At least to talk about them, as you pointed out. By the way, we were just talking about that summit on Canada-U.S. relations where the Prime Minister was talking to business leaders and obviously political leaders as well. I mean, when you're hearing some of the policy alternatives being discussed there, do you feel like they go far enough? I mean, for example, removing interprovincial trade barriers.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately a little skeptical about some of the measures on the table. I mean, interprovincial trade barriers are kind of held up as this panacea, but I think the numbers there are pretty inflated. When you ask, what are the actual trade barriers people are concerned about, it's actually kind of hard to find some besides some like trucking regulations. I'm not sure that, we can really all of a sudden create this big boon to the Canadian economy. I'm also concerned about suggestions that like an east-west pipeline would help us in any way. That's not going to be a short-term solution. And in the long term, it just makes us, more dependent on a very volatile resource. So there are other options, but right now, I don't think we're thinking big enough.
Hadrian, thank you so much for bringing up some of those big thoughts. Definitely, we live in unprecedented times, and some of this out-of-the-box thinking is, as you said, at least something that people can discuss. Thank you, Hadrian.
Thank you.
Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Trump also stepped up his threat of annexing Canada on board Air Force One. He pointed out again to an inflated trade deficit and a lack of military spending.
Canada, we'll see what happens with Canada, but the people of Canada would be paying less than half of the tax. If you look at the tax, they're going to be paying less than half the tax. They don't pay very much for military, and the reason they don't pay much is they assume that we're going to protect them. That's not an assumption they can make, because why are we protecting another country? Now, I love the people of Canada. We have a great relationship. But if they became our 51st state, it would be the greatest thing they could ever do. It would be unbelievable. It would be a cherished state. And think of how beautiful that country would be without that artificial line running right through it. Somebody drew it many years ago with a ruler, just a line. You look at how beautiful that is, wow, it would be very exciting. But if you look at Canada, it would be cherished as a 51st state. They don't pay their share of military in NATO. They pay very little for military. They're not protected at all. And the reason is they think we're going to protect them. The other thing is we subsidize them to the tune of about $200 billion a year. If we stop doing that, if we stop allowing them to make cars through tariffs and other things, cars, trucks, etc., what they make, they're not viable as a country.
So would you agree that it's a more aggressive foreign policy than your first term? Why is it?
It's more aggressive. It's better. Why? Because I think I've had a lot of experience. And in my first term, I was fighting everybody because they were very aggressive toward me. I always said survival and taking care of the country, not necessarily in that order.
Just after announcing he will impose a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports into the U.S. tomorrow, Trump was seen in the stands in New Orleans, becoming the first sitting president to attend a Super Bowl. Keep it here on CBC News Network.